Well, I was looking for a good book to take along on our vacation last week. You know, there's nothing like relaxing on the beach with the beat of the surf in the sand and the squeals of children jumping waves. It was a really great week with family. And the icing on the cake, I found that good book. It's called Peaceful Neighbor, Discovering the Countercultural Mr. Rogers. And it's written by our own Michael Long, professor right here at Elizabethtown College. It took me back to our girls' growing up years, back to the beautiful day in the neighborhood, and the assurance that everyone is special just the way you are. An ordained Presbyterian minister, Fred Rogers, was a radical pacifist in his own quiet way. And I think he might have been a bit brethren had he had the opportunity. Rogers tells of going to the hospital to visit his mentor, William Orr, who had suffered a stroke. Wanting to glean as much wisdom as possible from this aging and ailing man, Rogers asked him, what is one word that would strike down evil? Orr thought only for a moment, and then he said, one little word, forgive. Rogers often recounted the poignancy of that story and the poignancy of that word, forgive. There is power in forgiveness. Hear this story from the Gospel of Matthew. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you, 77 times. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. And as he could not pay, the Lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him by the throat, he said, pay what you owe. So Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, have patience with me, and I will pay you. But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their lord all that had taken place. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, you wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you? And in anger, his lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart. Well, this summer, we have been on an adventure, looking at some of the parables of Jesus. In Vacation Bible School, children and teachers alike went digging for treasure, looking for the secret meaning in the parable stories of Jesus. In worship, we've continued the dig, deeper yet. And so this morning, we might be expecting to dig up some new dirt, so to speak, when we look more closely at this final parable that some know as the parable of the unforgiving servant. However, scholars seem to agree that this parable, which compares the kingdom of heaven to a king who is intent on settling debts, is neither unclear nor particularly difficult to translate and understand, even for our modern context. The power of forgiveness is clear. This story doesn't have a secret message. We have the ears to hear and the eyes to see, to know and understand the magnitude of God's wide mercy, God's limitless love, and God's endless grace as seen in Jesus. We, as believers in God and followers of Jesus, can't help but pay it forward. It's not always that easy, though. Whether it's as giver or receiver, forgiveness can be very difficult, and it certainly can be an act of humility. Some of you may remember the 70s and 80s sitcom, Happy Days. There's one particular episode that kind of stands out to us. It's with the Fonz, Arthur Fonzarelli, and he was too cool for words. He was also kind of the bad guy of the group. So listen to what advice he had and maybe was sorry for as he shared with Ralph Malph.
Don't forget that Fonz real. It's not important. I figured I'd hang it in the barracks and cheer up the guys.
Malph, you're not going to hang these up at any barracks because you're not going to join the Marines. Just take all this stuff home, okay?
But Fonzie, not join? I'm all packed. You told me it was the right thing to do.
Look, I know what I told you to do, but when I told you to do that, I was... Ralph, I was not exactly right.
What do you mean, not right?
I mean, not right.
I don't get you. You mean you were wrong?
Yeah, that's right, Malph. I was what you just said I was just then, yeah.
Wrong? The Fonz wrong?
Malph, look. There is a first time for everything, huh?
It's not always that easy. Sometimes we too have trouble saying that we were wrong and that we're sorry. Although the hearers of Jesus' story too would have understood clearly the call to forgive and to ask for forgiveness, to say that we're wrong, some of the numerical facts would have flabbergasted the original audience, really hit the point home for them. The first slave owed the king 10,000 talents. Now, a talent is a measure of weight. It's close to about 130 pounds. In monetary terms, this was most likely 130 pounds of silver. The debt of 10,000 talents was about 150,000 years' worth of income. There was certainly no way that that could have been repaid. Now, the debt of the second slave was 100 denarii. A denarius is a small silver coin, roughly 1 day's wage. The debt was not small, but it was not earth-shattering either. So, impetuous Peter was asking what everyone else was thinking, including us. When is enough enough? He begins by establishing that we might consider a fairly high bar of forgiveness, a significant concession to those who might hurt us. Should I or we forgive someone as many as 7 times? That seems generous, if not munificent. After all, aren't second, let alone 7th chances exceedingly rare in our lives? A do-over 7 times. But Jesus, as he often does, poses a radical suggestion, not 7, but 77, or 7 times 70, according to some translations. The point is not the precise number. The point of Jesus' response to Peter's question is that there is no need for a ledger whatsoever. Forgiveness is a deep reservoir of grace. Forgiveness lies at the heart of our faith in an ever-forgiving God and our love for one another as brothers and sisters. Jesus speaks of the necessity of forgiveness because he knows the effects unforgiveness has on individuals, communities, and the world. While all major religions teach about the necessity of forgiveness, it has only recently been that the medical and scientific worlds have begun to delve into the importance of forgiveness and well-being. It is now widely known that unforgiveness, or holding on to past hurts and resentments, deeply affects our emotional and our physical health. Jesus speaks to the necessity of forgiveness for health and well-being, whether it's an individual, a community, or a country. Forgiveness has the power to heal relationships by requiring us to let go, to turn the page, to refuse the right to hold on to bitterness and to anger. Forgiveness, in short, sets things right again. Forgiveness is ultimately a decision about the past, the decision to accept both that we cannot change the past and that the past does not have to hold us captive. It is a decision about the past that ultimately determines the future. To be certain, forgiveness is not an excuse for unjust behavior, and to forgive is not necessarily to forget. Forgiveness is not denying our hurt. When we minimize what has happened to us, when we gloss over it, we tell ourselves that it really was not all that bad or that we deserved our pain, we cannot really forgive. Forgiveness is a possibility only when we acknowledge the negative impact of another person's or people's actions or attitudes in our lives. Author and retreat leader Marjorie Thompson writes, "To forgive is to make a conscious choice to release the person or people who have wounded us from the sentence of our judgment, however justified that judgment may be. It represents a choice to leave behind our sentiment and our desire for retribution, however fair such punishment may seem. Forgiveness involves excusing persons from the punitive consequences they deserve because of their behavior. The behavior remains condemned, but the offender is released from its effects as far as the forgiver is concerned. Forgiveness means the power of the original wound's power to hold us trapped is broken. Some events and situations should not be forgotten, and forgiving does not make them okay or acceptable. The Holocaust, slavery, exploitation of children and women, infidelity, a damaging lie, abuse, betrayal, white supremacy. There is another story, also a real-life story, of forgiveness that comes out of South Africa and the injustice of apartheid. Archbishop Desmond Tutu was raised in one of the townships, really a shanty town, where black South Africans were kept. He lived apartheid. He and his family experienced firsthand. Several of his friends were imprisoned and killed in the violence that defined South Africa under apartheid. When that whole system of oppression ended, the people of South Africa faced a crossroads. Would they simply live out the script of every oppressed people throughout all of history, whereby the oppressed become the oppressors? Or might they find a different path that had potential to lead to healing for both groups, the oppressed and the oppressors alike? The leaders of the new South Africa formed a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to try to seek that different path, that other way of living, as we would call it. Instead of punitive measures, the whole purpose of the commission was to give victims the chance to tell their stories, to have their suffering acknowledged, to confront their oppressors face to face, and to give the oppressors a chance to tell their truth about the crimes and to seek forgiveness and clemency. They had no idea what would happen from this, but as it turned out, again and again, oppressed and oppressor came together and experienced genuine reconciliation based on the experience of crimes acknowledged and forgiven. One of the foundational principles of this experience is what Desmond Tutu calls Ubuntu, the idea that we all share a common humanity, and the only way that we can thrive is together. The power of forgiveness changed history forever. Forgiveness is central to the kingdom of heaven, that kingdom that Jesus ushered in with the beginning of his earthly ministry, that kingdom that is already here, but not yet fully. If the past week has taught us anything, it's that hatred and violence and keeping score and getting back at simply are not working. The vicious circle of bitterness, hatred, and violence can be broken as we saw in South Africa. We saw it in the Holy Land with the Parents Circle, a unique grassroots organization comprised of Israelis and Palestinians who have lost immediate family members to the conflict. They come from all walks of life with one thing in common: they share the same pain and recognize that if they, Palestinians and Israelis who have paid the ultimate price, can understand the concept of Ubuntu, then anyone can. As they tell their personal stories and journeys to reconciliation, it opens eyes to the humanity and narrative of the other side. Robbie, who has the short hair, second from the left, shared her story with us. Her son David was pursuing a master's degree in education to become a teacher. He was part of the peace movement in Israel and did not want to serve in the occupied territories when he was called in for reserve duty. He was shot and killed at age 19, and it was clear from this mother's story, shared in deep pain, that this was her beloved son and the light of her life, who had a bright and shining future, one that could make a difference in the world. But, she says, rather than seeking revenge, she has tried to see the humanity in the other, and she has been able to operate out of compassion as she shares her story with a new generation and works at ways that make for peace through forgiveness. Seated next to Robbie, the man in the middle, in our circle was Bassam, a Palestinian man. In 2007, Bassam's 10-year-old daughter fell victim to an Israeli sniper's bullet on her school playground. He wept as he spoke of her and as he explained that the bullet that killed her was from an American M16. The Israeli soldier who shot her had been trained by the American military and was riding an American Jeep. Yet here was Bassam, sitting in a circle, seated next to an Israeli, talking with Americans and speaking of peacemaking. He spoke of his need to give up being a victim of a circumstance. And if that's not the ultimate forgiveness, then I don't know what is. We have been talking about the kingdom of heaven and what it's like these past many weeks. And with the violence and hate that appear to be on the increase here and around the world, sometimes that kingdom seems farther and farther away. And yet, as we come together and commit together to follow in Jesus' way, as we remind one another what it means to have a God who forgives without limits, as we encourage one another, perhaps we are being prepared. Perhaps we are being called, sisters and brothers of mine, for such a time as this. May it be so. I think it is so.